The purpose of this video is to give you some oversight into the simple way you can enter data into Prism. So let's imagine we've launched Prism and for whatever reason we're on this screen right here. I can either double click here or I can go up to the Prism up here and open up a new project file. When I get this project file, I get this screen. It's important for you to realize that Prism basically guides you to the kind of data entry you should choose on the basis of the data that you've collected or the graph that you'd like to create. So for example, here we have XY data entry. And what that is telling you is basically if you have data where you basically have continuous response variable on the Y and the X-axis both, and you're going to create data points and connect lines or draw curves through them, this is your option right here. It's telling you in this image right here that your data format or your table format is going to look something like this. So for example, you will make entries into the X column right here to basically correspond to what you have over here on the graph. And then you would make entries into the Y column on the basis of your treatments and the number of replications that you have in your treatments. If you choose, you can add a label to each of these rows, but for the most part, what we typically do is we'll label the columns when we're entering data in this format right here. You have a choice as to the number of different basically columns that you'll have here. So for example, you can have a single Y value for every one of your X data points right here, or you can have multiple Y values for every one of your data points that you enter. Or you may have already done some calculations, for example, getting the mean and standard deviation and the number of samples, for example, in something you did with the data in Excel, and you can enter the data in either of those formats as well. So that's XY data, and the point is that use this to kind of guide you as to whether this is the proper data entry solution for the data you have. You have 5 other options for entering data beyond XY. Okay, the first of these is the simple column format, and that's basically for an experiment that looks something like this, where you're basically going to compare the heights of various variables on the explanatory variables on the x-axis here and some response variable that you have right here. So in the columns, you basically, every row would be a replicate of the treatment that you did for that particular variable right here. So you might have just 2 rows, 2 replicates of a control treatment, or 2 replicates of a treatment group right there. So this is basically the format that you would use for bar graphs. If you had basically an experiment where you had 2 or more, if you had 2 grouping variables, you would choose the grouped data entry point. So what I mean by 2 grouping variables are basically is if you have basically variables labels on both the x-axis and on the inset right here. And you would enter the data basically if you wanted to make precisely this kind of graph, you would enter the inset labeled data as columns, and then the grouping variable you have here on the x-axis, male versus female, you would enter that as rows. Or you put that as rows, I should say. Contingency is basically the kind of experiment where every row defines some treatment or exposure. Okay, so for example, whether somebody smoked or didn't, and then you're basically counting the objects for each one of these in some other way. So for example, we have numbers of cases and numbers of controls. We have smoked or never smoked, and we would basically put in here the number of subjects in these cells right here, the number of subjects that were, for example, cases who smoked, or cases or control subjects who smoked, for example, in that one. If you're dealing with survival data, you would put it in here. Prism has basically kind of a dedicated spot for that and some analysis that goes along with that. I'm not going to talk too much about survival analysis in the course, but that's there. And then finally, if you want to make a pie graph, Then, and you wanted to do it with sorted data, the kind of data that basically has mutually exclusive categorization. Um, it could be ordered or sorted, I should say. You would put that data in here. So, for example, you can have just simple two categories, male or female, or you can have three categories if you wanted to. You can have male, female, and ambiguous, and then count the number of cases in each one of those, for example. So it's pretty straightforward. You just basically kind of see in your own mind what kind of graph you want to make, and then look at Prism and see which graph it's suggesting, and you're pretty much on your way there. So let's look at one of these um, by using some of the sample data that are available for this. So you'll see that with every one of these types of data entry, they have different sample data that you could load up and begin to play with. And so that's kind of fun. So let's deal with this one right here with some correlation data. Let's take a look at that and let's see what happens. So we're doing correlation data because it's a simple XY kind of data entry format. And when I load up that data, I'll X out these annoying things right here for now, but you've got these kind of explanations right here. The data that they are giving us are basically the explanatory variable is levels of ozone that you see right here, and then the response variable are labeled solar R, wind, and temp. And I'm not really sure exactly what these things are. I clicked on the project info, and he hasn't kind of loaded that up, so it's not really a big deal, but we might have discovered something by doing that. So here's our data. It's entered in an XY format, and what Prism does is it automatically plots out any of the data that you've entered into the corresponding format. So we could look at this right here, and we could see what the data is plotted out as. It's very convenient. It's already been kind of colorized for me. Here we're plotting out basically a scatter graph, but we could also plot out connected lines if we wanted to, or we could not plot out the symbols at all. Or if we wanted to, we could get this really confusing bar graph out of this. But obviously this is a little bit, more readable, so we could kind of go with that. If I didn't like the table format that I have right here, I can always change it. And kind of the simplest and easy way to change a format is to click on this right here. And I can change all of that data to something else. I could change it to group data, for example. This is going to be a really noisy thing to have done. And if I change it to group data, it doesn't change anything right here. So I'll have to go up to the graph family and change it to some options I have for that. And I can completely change what's the presentation of the data if I did something like that, which may be useful and instructive. The point I'm trying to make by just kind of plopping through all of this is that it's very, very simple with Prism. You literally have one-click tools to just kind of simply change the way that your data is set up and the way that your data is actually presented in graphs and stuff like that. So it's really, really simple and easy to work through. And I urge you guys to just kind of play with it and just explore and use some of these sample data sets to do that. And you'll find that you'll be able to learn and master Prism literally very, very quickly, probably on the scale of an hour or so, just kind of poking around with some of these sample data sets that they provide. So why don't you do that if you don't have a lot of experience with Prism? It'll help you kind of get up to speed very, very quickly, and you'll see some of the advantages and I think some